on the executive committee uh, of the urban design panel with Bob Boylo, my colleague who's right there, and Sean Daddy. Unfortunately, half of our ex-con team couldn't make it today, so we had to scramble a bit just right now to see of who's doing what. And I'm going to host. I'm in an office where the protocol is having to wear a mask, so this is going to be what it's going to be here. Um, we do have talking points that were from a memo from the XCOM that was part of your registration. So we're going to work off of those notes uh, and really try to open up the discussion as much as possible. So welcome again. As I said, my name is David McElnay. I'm an architect by profession and an urban do oversee over urban design in the city of Hillsborough. The Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society Landscape Architects, and is composed of professionals from those three organizations with a shared interest in urban design. We are joined today by the American Institute of Architects Portland. Adrian Morris is here, and Kurt Wilson is the executive vice president who uh, uh, generously sponsor our meetings on Zoom. Previously, as most of you know, we were meeting at the Center for Architecture. Now the AIA hosts us here on Zoom.
Are you going
Those
to play afterwards?
those announcements are seen
Yeah.
at the
Banana picture.
Thursdays at 3 newsletter put out by the AIA, uh, as well as the email list. So if you want to get on the email list, as soon as you register for this panel, you are part of the panel and will receive future notifications. So as we say, participation in any event makes you a panel member. We encourage you to sign up, and when you register, you will be notified monthly. So if you have future panel presentation ideas, we encourage you also to email Adrian Morris at AIA Oregon, and she's actually going to drop that in the chat box on the side. These presentations are recorded in a Vimeo format file and then are archived on a folder in the AIA Oregon uh, web access. And that will be also provided by Adrian following this presentation. So we're gonna typically there'll be about a 30-minute presentation and then followed by Q&A. Right now, I'm gonna try to like roll us into it with some of the points that John Spencer from our XCOM had bracketed for discussion and then open it up for discussion. Um, I'm not sure who on my XCOM is actually going to manage the chat function and help with questions, but we had asked Phil Namini if he could also keep an eye on that uh, to be more of an observer and a listener today, in his own words, for this discussion. So with that, I'm going to pull up um, the DOZARD recommended draft. That link was sent along with your registration, as well as the DOZA webpage link. And in the discussion topics that were there sent to you, the first one is about height. And I think that, for myself and for others on the executive committee, we're interested to hear what others' input are. We week or two ago we discussed these points, and now we're all ears. So the number one is that the DOZARD allows buildings up to 75 feet to use prescriptive standards, and the current threshold is 55 feet. So the height has been extended by another 20 feet under the prescriptive standards. Maybe I'll roll down through 5 points and then folks can open up on the ones that are most interesting to them. Number two is that the DOZARD proposal is to eliminate the required DAR when qualifying affordable housing projects. Choose a type 2 instead of the required type 3. Current requirements requires a DAR when a type 2 is picked. So the proposal is to eliminate the required DAR if it's an actual affordable housing that's choosing a type 2 track. Number 3 is factors reviewed during design review. DOZARD does not include zoning entitlements, maximum height, and maximum FAR as features that can be reduced during the design review process. So we've condensed that to simply point out that these elements, such as FAR and maximum height, they are not included as features that can be reduced during a design review.
Hey, David, this is Phil real quick. We did get a request to maybe have you share the screen. So since it looks like you're reading off the screen, I don't know if you want to try to
Yes, I
pull
can
up
just
the memo that you're referring to.
sorry, that's not it. Right. So what do you all see on your screens?
You have it, David. We're seeing the,
The urban design panel April discussion?
yes, we have.
Okay.
We can see the
thank you.
summary, but not the letter.
The link at the very bottom says view full discussion items. That will have more detail, and I think there are more items than just those 5.
Do you want to show the one at the bottom, the link at the bottom?
Yeah, there you go.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Adrian, can you share the link again
Yeah, I'll put that link in the chat.
in the chat?
Yeah. Just 1 second.
So go ahead, David. You're on we can't see your mouth moving because you have the mask, but you're on mute.
I'm a little flustered because this is all sort of last minute. And I'm jumping between technologies now. We're doing partial rotation into the office. So I'm not the best guy to be moving screen shares around right now. Can you see the April 14th memorandum on your screens?
We do.
Okay, so this is the link that you had just referred to, and this is what you get when you hit that link from your registration, which should have returned to all of you via email. And it's a more expanded version of the list that I was started into. So I stopped at number 3, which was factors reviewed during design review. I would assume some of you have had a chance to review these points in this memo before this panel. But I'm not sure whether or not to just stop here and begin to allow people to give input, Bob, or continue to go down through.
Phil, how would you like to receive this information? You said that you'd really want to have a discussion with the UDP panel and just hear comments, correct?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I am just sort of an observer and be able to answer possible technical clarification questions, because ultimately this is going to what you want to do is create a letter that goes to City Council. I can't really affect change anymore, so it's in the City Council's hands to listen and take testimony and make decisions about whether they want to change the recommendation that came from the Planning Sustainability Commission and the Design Commission. But it might be worthwhile just to kind of put out there that at this point, what we're working on is a recommended draft. It came from the 2 recommended bodies. I'm 90% sure that we're having a hearing on May 12th, but I haven't gotten that final ironclad thing that allows me to send out the notice, but that is what we're shooting for, is a May 12th City Council hearing. The database is open to take testimony. on this project. And my sense is the panel should do is discuss these items and make a decision about what are the important items and what things you want to concentrate on for the written testimony.
So let's open it up to the panel. I'm going to ask that everyone at least mute themselves unless they're speaking, because we're still getting some feedback, but it's really a chance for us to hear everyone's comments. Don't all jump in at once.
Some of the others we haven't covered just yet is that are very interesting is the design commission membership. And you can see that we actually have our draft recommendations embedded in each one of these points. So this is where our executive committee stands as of today. So that may also stimulate some comment.
Well, let's just, David, maybe we just jump in there. That's something that we wanted to discuss because we wanted to make sure that we didn't have people there that are siloed, meaning that they're only interested in their one profession, and especially getting urban designers in there.
Yeah.
Looking at the big picture. So it's just not looking out for, as an architect, I'm looking out just for the architecture, but everyone is actually wearing several hats. Everyone's looking at sustainability. Everyone's looking at the urban form. Everyone's looking at materials and all those. So that's something we wanted really to discuss.
Right. And I can add just a little bit more to that, which is that one of the what ifs that came up while we were talking about it is that if you don't have this kind of urban design or integrated approach in, say, a person who comes from a natural resource management background or a sustainable buildings practice background, maybe technical expertise. However, you could have a quorum where most of the folks really don't have an eye on the impact on urban design from any discussions being had.
We thought this was one of the most important issues. 6 years ago, that was why the new formation of the urban design panel was formed, to really bring the three professions, landscape architecture, planning, and architecture, to talk about what we all share, because our first charge was to look at the DOZA at that time. And we wanted to make sure we were still on track on following that all the way through the process. If we don't hear comments, we'll act like teachers and start calling on people.
That I would say, if we're not going to get any bites on the adding 2 members, that the proposal that the DOZARD has in it, right below it is something that members on the XCOM pointed out, is that there are no urban design diagrams, district character statements specifically included in the draft. And we brought this idea up and are going to recommend diagrams and character statements for the districts that would set a template that everyone could clearly understand, whether you're on the panel or whether you're in the review component, or whether you're a developer trying to do a building or a design team approaching it. So we're certainly looking for people's thoughts on this idea of adding design diagrams and character statements into the DOZA.
I think the diagrams are a great idea. This is Heather Flint Chatto. I'm an urban designer and urban planner of 20 years, and also the director of PDX Main Streets. And so I think having those diagrams would certainly help illustrate that. I am concerned that the character statements will be more applicable for design guidelines, but for the majority of people that are going to go through standards, those character statements feel insufficient to me. So we've been advocating for Main Street standards. I feel like this is a really big gap right now. I think there's been a lot of great work done, but the low-rise commercial storefront analysis we call the vintage Main Street study, and we feel like that's really been a critical piece that's outstanding. And so we'd be really interested to hear from others some possible alternatives. We've seen a lot of communities advocating for Main Street standards. So we're wondering if there's in addition to the character statements, something more concrete, because these are essentially our mini downtowns. And that relates to the design review threshold too. We have a 45-foot high design review threshold for downtown. And so we'd like to at least see some parity there. So those would be the two big things I'd love to see your panel also address. I put a link to the vintage building study in the chat. And if you go through that, I think the only thing that the city did at the time, because they were working on the mixed use zoning project, they looked at downzoning those areas. But in the memo, one of the alternatives that they talked about was to do nothing now, but to do Main Street standards. So that was 2016. And so this seems like if we don't take a bite at that apple now, we're missing a chance to do that. So we've got some recommendations for what those standards should be. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that one? I see a few people from some neighborhoods and business districts too.
I have a few thoughts. There are a lot of these settings in our city, and I think, Heather, it's good that you put a spotlight on that. I agree with the concept of requiring diagrams that show how projects fit into the district that they are proposed. I also agree with the 75-foot height allowance, although I'm not sure which zone that's in. I certainly agree with it.
And you're specifically referring to the design commission threshold for review?
Right.
But when you have these tiny little districts where you have 1- and 2-story buildings, I mean, if you have the standards, if you have Main Street standards, then no problem, but we don't really have that. So we're getting a lot of pushback around density, partly because we don't have the right fit, I think, in those places. If we had good standards, we may not necessarily need a lower, design review threshold.
Do you think those can be achieved by the urban design diagrams and the criteria?
No, I don't. I think that will help. But I think there are some pieces that are missing. If what we've done is we've gone through and we made Main Street guidelines, actually started for division, but then expanded for, they've been adopted by local communities and business districts for 12 Southeast Main Streets. But there's no pathway for community-based planning to be recognized. So we've done a lot of the work for these areas already. We've mapped all the pattern areas, standard, the patterns of those places, and we've created a list of our dozen standards that we think would be good for perhaps a Main Street plan district. I'm looking for the right mechanism. So I'd be curious if that's a way to get at it, or to embed just a few key standards into the regular sort of base standards. It seems like
the embedding idea would be more doable. Would you agree that the district kind of plan diagrams, urban design diagrams, are a step in the right direction?
They're a step. What about setback?
Setback or step backs?
Well, setback. I mean, if you're talking about, low buildings and increasing density, sometimes you can increase density by keeping the building in the front only a 1-story, but then allowing the building in the back to be 2-3 stories. So you're doing more like a stepping.
Yeah, I think you're talking about a step back more, like an upper level step back.
Have you ever seen what in DC, what George Washington University did on I Street. They kept all small buildings in the front, and their hospital was in the back. But when you're on the street level, what you feel is comfortable because of the low, because it's all 1 story or 2 stories, and then the building behind it is 8 stories. So you're able to shield a massive building by using more comfortable housing, comfortable restaurants, comfortable height.
It's certainly a strategy that would help our, existing 1 and 2 story small Main Street centers add that higher density, but not feel like it at the street level. We've been advocating for step backs for about 3 or 4 years. But
I think that's what I hear a lot from people just talking about the increased density, that they feel that they're being crushed by a building, and there is a physical reaction. So when you're going taller, sometimes it's nice to make that bridge of a step back. I like both. I like setbacks and step backs.
So we've advocated for upper level step backs above 3 stories. So if the 4th story would have either a minor step back, maybe 4 to 5 feet, or a major step back of 8 to 10 feet, that you could get on those. So I really would hope people will look at that link, because they're already mapped areas of these important centers that the city already did. And at a minimum, those areas, could really use a step back. So there's some things that would be really helpful for those particular areas, like
absolutely
upper, above 3 stories. But also to have that sort of Main Street pattern where you have the base, middle, top, and you have a consistent pattern of, human scale windows of vertical aligned and horizontal. You have the base, middle, top, you have articulated roof lines, you have regular rhythm of recessed entries. You have this whole set of common Main Street patterns that you see all across our city, but we're missing that pattern language, that pattern area standards.
So this is David. I'm just going to jump in really quickly. So I think that when you look at the number 5 on the screen there, this idea that we've floated to as part of the memo we're developing for the DOZA is speaking specifically to districts subject to design review. So ideas like step backs, ideas like massing could be at least brought to the table as talking points, right? Because I don't think that there's a prescribed step back ordinance or regulation being proposed here. And the idea that if you can't touch FAR or what's legally developable, what you're entitled to develop, the idea behind diagrams or character statements is to make suggestions for the developing and design team in those areas that are subject to design review. That's as my understanding, Phil. There are not step back prescriptions proposed in this DOZA. Am I correct on that?
The Planning Commission wouldn't even talk about it. They didn't.
Yeah, I mean, basically, one of the things to keep in mind is this friction between, citywide design guidelines and then objective design standards, and then potential, character-driven neighborhoods. And so the amendments in DOZA don't preclude a lot of these features from being, added to a building to meet the guidelines, or even to align with the prescriptive standards, but they don't necessarily dictate them. There are some provisions, especially when a building is potentially next to a building that's a landmark, or next to a building on the historic resources inventory, that provide incentives to try to get at some of the features that Heather gets at, as far as ground floor window consistency and transom and things like that. But it's, once again, it's not a requirement. It's something that somebody could gain points for if they did the prescriptive path, and or if they were going through design review, they potentially could use that as a way to help meet the guidelines. So yeah, it's the difference between keep being a little more open-ended probably on the citywide guidelines. And so yes, it's quite possible with that you would have a situation where somebody would choose a different way to meet the guidelines that might not result in base, middle, top, and some other kind of traditional building features. And actually the assessment, one of the suggestions of the assessment was potentially to maybe move away a little bit from the base, middle, top kind of pattern language, but focus on other aspects that improve the public realm and site design.
Yeah,
And
one of the items in that basket of concerns would be public open space, right? And so one could argue that equally important, if not more important, is how to incentivize and how to achieve usable public open space that's at the interface between private property and public space, right? That's not a park that the city park system is putting out there, but rather building by building, proposal by proposal, where are the incentives to get that really critical piece, which is that's at the nexus of what our urban design panel is feeling that it can be very difficult to achieve. So Phil's point is well taken in that there may be options that are brought to the table that don't speak to the architectural components of scale and proportion, but really talk about community spaces in the urban environment. So let's move the discussion over to another important piece that I want to return to, which was number 2 here, and we can certainly return to to other previous discussions. And that is something I'm curious to hear what folks think about, in that it's proposing to eliminate the required DAR when you're bringing affordable housing projects to the table. And our recommendation after discussing it is to require a DAR when type 2 review process is chosen. Maybe support an expedited process, but that good design review is a critical part of affordable housing. Affordable housing shouldn't be seen as bereft of design or expedited at the exclusion of design considerations. And I know Bob is really interested to hear if anybody can pipe up.
Yeah, let me just add in. I mean, I think we look at the DAR as like a free pinup. If a project needs some consideration or ideas or something like that, it shouldn't be, oh, you have to go through, there is a cost obviously for the DAR, but the benefit is you get the bigger picture. Now, if it's expedited or something like that, we don't know, but it is a good discussion item.
So one thing, this is Phil again, maybe I'll turn my video on while I'm talking. I do want to mention sort of how this proposal came about, just to kind of put it into context, because that might help shape the discussion. So currently, DAR is generally not required. A pre-application conference is required for type 3 reviews, which is a conference with all the bureaus. The DAR, of course, is a design advice request held with the design commission. There are, I think, only 1 or 2 situations where a certain kind of bonus or thing are being used where we actually state that a DAR is required. I think there's potentially maybe something with East Portland and something maybe in downtown, but generally the DAR is not a required provision. When the housing emergency got set up, one of the provisions that got put in there was this idea that in Central City or Gateway, if an affordable housing project meeting certain specific requirements, which is basically that 20% of the units are affordable to those making 60% or less MFI, and it's also considered a Housing Bureau subsidy project. So it's something that's partnering with the Housing Bureau on. In those situations, if it's in Gateway or in Central City, and it would normally trigger a type 3, the housing emergency made it a type 2X, which was a type of review that normally wasn't assigned to design reviews. or historic reviews. It's actually applied to both design and historic reviews, but did require the DAR. When we were working on this and trying to decide whether to make this a permanent feature in DOZA, we did not want to continue kind of this special review situation. And so we had as the option that it would be a type 2 review and that the DAR would be optional like it is for every other project. Part of the other reason behind this idea was the fact that a type 2 review, while it still has the same approval criteria, the process is that the approval is made by BDS staff and the design commission's the appeal body. So there was a little concern about the idea of having an appeal body be the body to review the DAR if they potentially never are actually going to review the original project unless it's under appeal. So what we decided to do with this idea was to align it more with how we normally set up things. Or we went to just allowing it as a type 2 review. I do want to mention that since the housing emergency came in about 5 years ago, I'm only aware of 2 projects that have actually taken advantage of the type 2 option instead of the type 3. And one of them was in Central City, or kind of River Place area, and one was in Gateway. So it hasn't been an option that's been taken very often. But I just wanted to provide that context, because that may help a little bit with the discussion.
Thanks very much. If I may say a couple of things. I'm John Zarnicki. I'm an architect, urbanist, and actually past chair of the Landmarks Commission. And a couple of things come to mind. Oh, and I also have experience with the state and affordable housing. A couple of things come to mind. First of all, at the risk of being strong, I would say that that removing the requirement for review for affordable housing can open the door to making developments which are contrary to notions of livability, which affordable housing should in fact support more than completely. There are a couple of ways that this happens. One is that if the structures are not subject to design review, to vigorous design review, it will become very evident which projects are affordable housing and which are not, because there will be no requirement for compatibility in historic districts, for example, or in design review for sensitivity to the same extent as is required for other projects. Now, given that, maybe I'll just wait and say that. It's difficult for me to say this any more strongly, and I appreciate you listening. And
thank you. That's a great point, John. Thank you so much. This is David. I'm just going to jump in and say Dave Audi also had his hand up on this subject. Dave, would you like to speak?
Sure. Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. So I think the issue here is not about whether or not the DAR is required. It's about lowering the standards for affordable housing, kind of what John was getting at. So I think what DOZA is proposing is that in Gateway and Central City, you can do affordable housing through a type 2 and everything else goes through a type 3 that would otherwise qualify. And to me, I think that's offensive and puts our values in the wrong place. Either design review works or it doesn't. I don't think it should work for some people and not work for others. I'm wholly in favor of as much housing as possible and building it as fast as possible, but also as well as possible. So whatever the urban design panel can do to support those efforts and make sure that we're prioritizing both quantity and quality, I think that's the direction we need to head. Thank you.
And just to clarify, there is no difference in what guidelines apply. There is no lowering of the standard. What we're talking about when we talk about it, and this is where maybe Portland might be a little different than other jurisdictions when we talk about type 3 land use reviews, type 2 reviews. a type 3 land use review and a type 2 land use review are both a land use review. As a design review, they would both be subject to the same approval criteria, the same guidelines outside of the central city. That'd be those citywide design guidelines that we're working on. The difference is who is reviewing it and making the decision, and
Correct.
how long that process
So,
is.
yes.
But if I could follow up,
Go ahead, Dave.
real quick. Yeah, I mean, understood they're the same guidelines, but we all know why we're doing this. We're doing this or why developers want to avoid design review with affordable housing. It's because it's a lower threshold to go through staff. And it's less process, it's less public input, it's less visible. It's supposedly less time. I don't know if I buy that. But even though the criteria may be the same, the process is placed with less importance when it is a staff review, and I think that's just anathema to our values as Portland.
And I like that final point that, Phil, your point is well taken that the same thresholds apply, but there's kind of there's a implied lowering, as Dave just said, that in this making this differentiation that appears to prioritize time. And I think from the executive committee side that Portland is ready to understand design review as value add. And I think that everybody's ready to make sure that the process goes as smoothly as it can. And that would loop me back to another point we were just talking about a second ago, which is the selection of the folks that are going to sit on that design review is pretty critical to how it's going to function. So is there anybody that could give us feedback in our point about the composition of the commission memberships? Here on my screen, number 4, 2 members are proposed from Sustainable Building Practices and Natural Resource Management. Our point from the XCOM was that the language should be refined to speak to expertise in urban design, to try to make sure that no matter what the quorum that's sitting there any given day, that there's this shared understanding of how all these different disciplines build community. Can someone jump in and give us your thoughts on that?
What's critically missing is an equity component to this, because it's still based on professional criteria, and we're not getting at any equity issues in this, in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. That's a good point, and I think that that's implied in our notes here. We tried to pull this memo together quickly so that we could meet today, so we could get input, and I think we definitely will take that into consideration here for these recommendations.
I think it's important to also factor in who's participated in this process. How have diverse voices been included? Because I've seen the spreadsheet that Phil kindly shared with me. And, when we talk about 61 meetings, the majority of those are actually with staff. They're actually with different departments. They're, and very few of them are with communities. So I know that there's been a little bit of outreach to, some small groups, but I am not seeing diverse faces participating in this process. I go to meetings, I go to community meetings all the time, and I ask people, who's heard of DOZA? No one raises their hands. It's deeply concerning that the public engagement has been very poor on this. And I think that it puts the city at risk of being sued.
That is understood.
I'm deeply concerned, and I hear it all over the place.
I see your point. I'm going to add just a piece to that, which is that, interestingly enough, we are aware that there is a professional conversation between practicing professionals who've spent their whole lives trying to figure these things out for the good of the community. I think we're all here because we all share that single value that the work is to be done to build community. But interestingly enough, those aren't necessarily the same conversations that are happening with the specific populations in the different neighborhoods in the city. I don't know that.
Who have strong opinions about development and design, which is why we led a 7-year process to create Main Street design guidelines that have been adopted by all these communities. But what I hear from city staff is there's no pathway for community-led planning. Even though I'm a professional of 20 years and have done this work there, and we hired, you know, a former planning commissioner as our consultant, there is no pathway for these kinds of community-led planning efforts to be recognized. Albina Vision does not have a pathway to be, you know, for their work to be recognized. So even though we've created tools the city could use now, there is no pathway for that. And there's no way for that work that communities have had a voice and participated in to show up in DOZA. There's no way for even those as community guidance sources.
Well, I would argue, yeah, I mean, I see your point, and I'm just kind of speaking to make, I'm trying to get other folks to jump in here, but I'm speaking on 2 points there a second ago. One is that I'm trying to understand, aside from my past experience professionally, doing community design charrettes, opening the discussion, those us trying to emphasize the value of design review as a community forum. I think that should be recognized. And we absolutely have to have a professional role in the work. So I think the DAR is seen as the forum for community input. Now, there's a lot of community probably that doesn't feel extremely included in that thought or doesn't really think about it, or it's not first in their minds. And it is hard for us to understand how to do it otherwise. But the work should be done probably on the design team side or the developer team side when they bring it to a larger community forum. I don't know that DOZA can solve that problem. But I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hope for other people's thoughts on this.
I'm just going to say, from the professional end, I've been planner for 40 years, you know, the professional end is primarily privileged, elitist white folks. And I think there's very little opportunity for people of color in the community to participate at that level. And that's where it needs to open up. But we also have to have it, you know, at the community level, there has to be more input. And I mean, as a planner, I hadn't, until I talked to, you know, got involved with Heather, I didn't even know about DOZA, and I'm pretty up on stuff. So, but I'm also working in the community. I've worked in Alberta Main Street, and this is just, it's unacceptable in these days, you know, with the changing communities that we have.
It's very top down.
Very top down, and that's not the way we've done it in Portland, you know, over the years, and it seems to be the way that's sort of taken over in the last few years. But we need to be more inclusive, absolutely.
Well, I would just point out one observation is that by the time you hit design review, it's a little late for community input, right? Although it is kind of the last call, and you could get strong input at that point. Community input, in my assumption or my experience, would happen much, much, much earlier in the programming phase and doing design charrettes with folks. So that's just my observation there. I don't know if anybody else would like to put in any thoughts on the subject.
This is why we need the you know, Main Street design guidelines and standard, actually make them standards, because that's where you get the input early on. And
We've done the work to engage communities for years. Bill Cunningham said he had never seen anyone do more public engagement around design guidelines than we have done. And, you know, and so we've tried to give it to the city as a gift. I know that the Chinatown guidelines cost around $175,000. We have done more work than that and created 2 very professional documents leveraging, you know, professional planners, architects, landscape architects. How can we transition the gleanings from that work? You know, if you can demonstrate you've led, you know, professional best practice processes and you've demonstrated widespread community support, there needs to be a process. And that's an opportunity for Portland to lead with a community-based planning process. We actually have a forum coming up next week, actually on community-based planning policy. That's one of our initiatives. So I hope that you'll join us, and I'll put a link to the invitation for that. But I think, you know, that would be an opportunity for Portland to be a leader in creating a process that others, you know, could follow. So this is really about turning communities on to density. And one of the secrets that we've learned is they're perceived as NIMBYs because they don't have the design literacy to ask for what they want. So what we find is that they actually are supportive of density and infill. But when you are overdeveloping on very narrow lots, on narrow streets, at a very different scale, at a different size form, at a different style, at a different pattern, then you sort of create these spaceships that have landed in the middle of a neighborhood, and we create contrast. So you end up perpetuating an animosity towards the development. And when actually we want to turn people onto it. And what I find is they say, oh, but you know, we don't like any of this density. Oh, but we like that building on Grand.
Yeah.
You know, because it relates. And so how do we relate without replicating?
I would offer that in the course of a process that's finer grained, that's way further earlier in the steps to development, there's it's both ways, right? You get input from the community, and the community also has to be educated about what's coming down from like federal to state to local to what are the imperatives going on in terms of density or why this urban growth boundary functions the way it does, and what's important to keep about it. So I think it is a two-way conversation, but
David,
those are all good points.
I was just going to jump in and ask Heather, how have you been doing this? Because I'm assuming that it's more graphic. It's not so legalese. It's something that people can understand. You know, pictures are worth 1,000 words. And that gets back to our concern about bringing back, you know, more of the diagrams. I think I see that Patty's on the call, that bringing and linking back to some of the original diagrams that were done 20, 30 years ago in the Portland plan that were so strong that, you know, anyone could understand that. And then having that just as, you know, that a link to the past, but graphically showing it. You're probably Heather, in your meetings to the neighborhood, showing just simple diagrams. People say, yeah, because they get behind it because it's not yet developed, but the idea is there.
Well, we show that, but we also show a lot of pictures of, you know, what the pattern language is. So you might show the building at 14th and Hawthorne, which is a larger version of the building next door, picking different materials, relating on, you know, two sides to different things across the street, you know, versus the building that's adjacent to Little Port Canon, which is, you know, same height, but completely different. I have some graphics I can show right now if you wanted. But I think what people see in there is that, oh, this building is speaking the same language, even though it has its own identity, it's speaking the same language. And so that also, that there's something about human scale architecture that's missing. And I'm not talking about small buildings, but we talk about, you know, what are those human scale patterns that make people feel comfortable, like, you know, the vertical windows, which actually relate to the, you know, the human body. And that's how you can have a tall building still feel human scale.
Right. And so,
you talk about design literacy through that.
Yeah, the question we have is in our recommendations for DOZARD that Phil needs. What are some of the tools or recommendations that basically people can come to market sooner? I mean, typically, I'm not ready yet to show my DAR, then it's not baked. We want to get these ideas before they're baked. And so what are the tools? You know, one idea is, let's get back to the diagrams, you know, the partie, the big ideas.
I also think that a context elevation says it all. It absolutely, and it's not required. So I think that the guidelines and the standards are really good. I think they've done a lot of really good work. And I'm definitely, you know, our work is intended to support the city, to be, you know, where they have limited budgets and stuff. But what we find is that when communities want to understand what the impacts of a project are, that context elevation is so critical.
That's a good point. And I think we obviously right? And we have to boil down our response into this memo here to give Phil something to work with in the concept of context being addressed. Now, of course, you're going to have many contexts. So how do they decide to create these diagrams, and what are the contexts that they will choose to do? But I think that the exercise itself gets to what you're talking about, Heather, which is context-based response. And I think we're all in favor of that. I know that you know, I would also argue that we,
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get into say.
oh yeah, go right ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so blunt about it. I was actually talking to someone else for a moment. But now that I'm in, I'd like to reinforce the notion of context-based analysis. Truly, we keep seeing time and time again structures which are supposed to sit in neighborhoods or downtown, in which it's as though they came from somewhere else. And one of the things that comes to mind is also the use of the pejorative use of the word replication, which implies somehow that it needs to be different than anything else to be creative. A much more useful word is repetition or continuation, where there's a model that we're choosing, and the minute we start using that model, it becomes our own. Of course, it's going to be different. It's a different context, a slightly different use, so that the notion of scale, as has been said, has to do with the human body, and it has to do with the size itself in relationship to the way the building is broken up, because scale is how big is something in relationship to something else? What does it look like in relationship to something else? So dealing with the notion of context, exploring and reinforcing or reacting to context is essential to these standards, essential to what we should be dealing with DOZA.
I would also add to the idea of context, the not so necessarily, in addition to historical ideas, is that there's the context of where the sun is and how the water flows, and questions of possible opportunities for public open space. There's I think quite a large list of things that could be discussed and thought about.
I couldn't agree more with you, David. I think that's wonderful. I would also say that those are principles which have been and hopefully will continue to be applied for the next 3,000 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's other folks embedded in this. I can only see a short strip of everybody who's here today, but I would really love to try to elicit other people's thoughts.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
Can I make a comment? This is Sean Batty. I'm a member of the XCOM for ASLA. I have to jump off in a minute, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate the discussion and the focus on compatibility. I mean, that certainly is what draws most of attention, because we're talking about change in our city, and that's where the focus should be. I did want to just mention as an observation, I always find it interesting how much of the conversation seems to gravitate to whether buildings are too big, and haven't heard very much conversation about when buildings are too small. And I just wanted to remind folks, at least in my opinion, that many of the corridors in our city, not the ones that Heather's talking about, not the ones that are mapped where there's a historic fabric, but much of our city, in my humble opinion, is not plagued by a problem of buildings being too big. It's plagued by the problem of buildings being too small. And I just think that all of us as professionals, part of the reason we have these compatibility issues is maybe we're missing an opportunity to speak for buildings that are more than one story, particularly in our general commercial zones, those places that came after post-war that do tend to be a little bit forgotten. But I really appreciate the conversation, and I certainly took a lot away from it as an XCOM member. So I thank everybody for participating today.
I would just say I totally agree with Sean. You know, one of the things I think we're missing, and we have this building in balance initiative. You know, how do we build in balance, but how do we build and balance these places so that, you know, communities have asked, what is the amount of density that we're trying to accommodate for each neighborhood? And, that for my neighborhood in particular, for Richmond, we would like to see much taller buildings on Powell. It's the building height to street width ratio is much better, and a little bit more of, maybe a step back at the third story where you could bonus back that area for a plaza. And, so these are important pieces that have not been teased out of this conversation in DOZA. And I think I'm hearing from communities that they want to delay it. And I know the Urban Design Panel doesn't want that to happen. So we want to find ways that we can do that. But I think an important piece that hasn't been revisited is that there used to be a series of bonuses that were looked at in the mixed use zoning policy that were studied as ways that you could, sort of bonus up height. And all of those went away. The, plazas, green space, green roofs, affordable retail, and affordable housing, all of them went away because the analysis showed that people wouldn't do anything else they would do everything else except affordable housing. And we didn't revisit that when we got inclusionary zoning. So it's a really important piece, those step backs and bonusing that potential back for a plaza is a great strategy, is particularly for those little Main Street centers. So I really hope people will look at that study because the work's already been done. So at a minimum, we could be applying those Main Street district standards.
I like the concept of thinking about incentives as public benefit.
Yes.
And I think anybody who thinks from all of our different disciplines about urban design kind of knows immediately what I'm saying when I say that. I unfortunately wasn't scheduled to host today. I must go to host a pre-application meeting for a development project and real boots on the ground stuff. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump. Adrian is here. Bob is here for a moment or two.
Well, I think, Dave, if you don't mind, I think maybe we'll just end early since I also have to jump too.
Yeah.
But I think we'll get together as an exec group, taking some notes, and we'll continue on and giving the recommendations to Phil.
Adrian's dropping information into the chat box on where you can access all this stuff. You can reach all of us through Adrian Morris, for example, if you want to email thoughts and ideas from this. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Sorry it was a little haphazard today because we had an upset on who was going to do what, and but we wanted to make sure that we could hear your opinions and make the panel available today. So thanks again. Keep your eye on the next month's presentation. We'll get that out as soon as we can.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if anyone wants to know more about our recommendations, we'll post them on our DOZA site at pdxmainstreets.org/DOZA. We have a series of top 5 recommendations, and then we are putting together our DOZA dozen standards. It's going to Baker's dozen with a Main Street bundle. And we hope that might be something that could be considered more in the standards. So we'll share that with you, Bob.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, Michael.